Hello, and welcome to the podcast, episode 13, where today we're going to be discussing Top Gear. Top Gear has been around since 1977, and it went from an independent TV program to being owned by the BBC, which is the British Broadcasting Community, whatever the abbreviation means, but no one cares. So Top Gear, you've definitely heard it in your life. Even if you don't remember it, you've most definitely heard it. And if you don't know the name, you'll definitely know the name Jeremy Clarkson, which I'll get to in a minute. So as I said, Top Gear started in 1977, but there are very, very, very little archive. There's very little archive footage from the original Top Gear. Trust me, I've looked. But Top Gear is more notable for Jeremy Clarkson, Richard Hammond, and James May, which was the ultimate trio that made Top Gear one of the most popular TV programs in the world, even if it wasn't entirely liked, more disliked. So the first of the trio was Jeremy Clarkson, the most controversial and quote-unquote edgy of the three. And that's because he really just couldn't keep his mouth shut, and I really respect him for that. And that's why he was known. It's because he really said whatever he wanted, and that was really because back then you could really do anything on the BBC, whereas now that's a little less true. But back then, in the 2002 to 2015, they were allowed to do a lot of things. It's safe to say that Clarkson is a comedian, and he still is with his current television program, The Grand Tour, which I'll get to in a minute. He's definitely a comedian, but a lot of people know him as just an annoying little, what's a British word that I can use? I'll think of one later. But there are a lot of people that don't like him because he is mean toward Greenpeace, which is a group of environmentalists. He's mean towards bicyclists, Americans. He's just there are very few people that he isn't mean to, and those people are called pretty much everyone in Europe. But even so, he still will sometimes make fun of Germans. Sometimes, and he's made fun of the Spanish. I'll go into more detail with the controversies later. But the next person I want to talk about is James May, or better known as Captain Slow, and that was because he was the most laid back of the trio. No one. That's just his personality trait. That was just how he was, and he was known for that, and people like that. That was pretty much how the trio worked. Of course, that doesn't go without mentioning Richard Hammond, or Hamster. And the reason he was called Hamster is because he's short, or rather, not very short, but rather shorter than the other two. He was known as the little hamster. He was known as I don't know. I've forgotten the nicknames for him. But he was the most accident prone, and kind of still is. He got into a 10,000 horsepower dragster crash, an electric car crash, which resulted in a massive fire. He's crashed a Ferrari, he just nicked it into a bollard. But yeah, he was known for the crashes most of the time. So in a little summary, Clarkson was known as the genius. James was known as Captain Slow. He was the laid-back one. And Richard Hammond was known as the accident-prone little midget. in James May's own words. And I want to go real quick. I want to go back into the Jeremy Clarkson controversies. The first major controversy came when he was doing the classic rhyme between two vehicles, and he was the classic rhyme "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." But according to some idiots that hated Jeremy, they accused him of using the racial term, the N word. Now, obviously, he didn't Do it. He may have, but it's more likely that he didn't. And he made an apology video. Now, real quick, I want to say something. Apologizing is only for your family members. You never publicly apologize because it just makes things worse. That's all it does. You apologize, and then the person who you're apologizing to, because it's publicly apologizing, they realize, oh, I've gotten this person to do what I want them to do. So now I can pretty much do anything to them within reason. And Clarkson has apologized way too many times. It is his biggest mistake ever. Never apologize unless it's to your parents. The next major controversy was when Clarkson, Hammond, and May were building a bridge over the River Nile. And they were looking at the bridge, and there was a Spanish person on it. Now, Hammond and Clarkson were looking at the bridge, and Clarkson says, "That is a proud moment, but there's a slope on it." Now, for those of you unaware, slope is a term for a Spanish person, rather a rude one. But that was the joke. There was a Spanish person on the bridge, and he said there was a slope on it, as in there's a little hump on one side of the bridge. But obviously, he was referring to the Spanish person. Now, the final major controversy was when he punched one of the producers, and that was because the kitchen wasn't in order. It wasn't. So basically, because the kitchen wasn't in order, he would have to have a cold dinner. Now, Clarkson didn't exactly. How do I put this? Take to this nicely, so he punched one of the producers. Now, the BBC looked at this and said, "Nuh-uh, you're out." So here's the major issue with this. Remember when Chris Rock was slapped by Will Smith? Will Smith still got a reputation, and yet Clarkson was kicked off of what he was known for. Now, what I'm getting at this is one person got away with it and another wasn't. Now, obviously, they are managed by two different people. I mean, obviously, they're not completely managed by them, but you know, Will, whatever his name is still in movies as far as I'm concerned. And, you know, so is Clarkson, but Will Smith wasn't, you know, kicked off of making a movie. Whereas Clarkson was completely kicked off of Top Gear, the BBC. Can you see where I'm getting at? I don't really think that that's the reason why they kicked him off. I think there's a deeper meaning. Now, after this happened, he about a year later he made the Grand Tour, which is on Amazon Prime. And instead of being in a large hangar, it was in a little tent. I say little, but it was actually quite big for a tent. And the show still runs now. And I'll get into a little more of the Grand Tour later. But it still goes on now. I think they're filming filming an episode right now in Zimbabwe. But Clarkson still has a job on the TV, and so does May and Hammond. They still work with him. Basically, they were asked. Hammond and May were asked if they wanted to stay on Top Gear, and now, interestingly enough, May was constantly harassed by the news network, but Hammond never was. The only thing that I can find that he talked about getting about Clarkson getting kicked off was a tweet, and that's all that I can find. Now, May was completely overrun by the news network, and you can tell he had enough of it. And they were constantly asking him, "Will you still work with Jeremy?" And he said, "I think all three of us are a package," and I completely agree with that. Now, Top Gear didn't end after they left. It had been going on since 1977, and it still had a good reputation. So the BBC thought that they could get away with just putting some new people in and moving on. However, no, they put in two people instead of three, two, which was their first mistake. One of which was Chris Evans, which no one really knew and no one really cared about. And second presenter was Matt LeBlanc. And if you don't know the name, who that is, I'm not going to tell you who it is because no one really cares. They were only on Top Gear for a year. And LeBlanc left because he wanted to. It wasn't really his thing. He was never known for cars, and I don't think Chris Evans was either. No. Real quick, I've just realized something. Don't get this Chris Evans confused with the other Chris Evans that plays Captain America in the Marvel movies. That's not the Chris Evans that I'm talking about. This is a British Chris Evans that's about as tall as Hammond. Um, but Chris Evans left because the audience hated him. He couldn't handle the hate, which, I guess I understand. I mean, if you're running a massive program and no one really likes you, you kind of have an excuse to leave. But still, I mean, it's just a matter of if you enjoy doing it. So I guess he didn't. So over the years, Top Gear went through a wave of different presenters. I think there was one time where it had over five of them, which was really weird. But today it has three presenters: Freddie Flintoff, Patty McGinnis, and Chris Harris. And I just want to say, Freddie Flintoff and Patty McGinnis sound like the fakest names that I have ever heard. Now, Freddie, about more than 6 months ago, got into a wreck, and they had to completely halt the production of Top Gear. Now, this was actually bad enough. This was a bad enough crash to where they halted the entire production of Top Gear. Now, Clarkson actually responded to this halt and said, "You got to save Top Gear," because he was afraid for Top Gear. He thought that it was going to end, which was completely possible. Top Gear no longer had a good reputation, and it still doesn't. It didn't have a lot of substance, and one of its presenters was in the hospital. The perfect combination for the stoppage of everything for that entire BBC program. Now, real quick, I want to talk about the Grand Tour. And real quick, before I dive deep into it, I just want to say it has a scary resemblance to Top Gear. And obviously, they're not in trouble for that or anything. I mean, they can. It's not like the pattern of Top Gear had any copyright infringements or anything. Um, but the Grand Tour had a resemblance to Top Gear, and I say had because they actually completely changed the way the Grand Tour worked in 2019. It used to be they would talk in a tent with a bunch of audience around them, and they would talk about things in the tent, and then they would roll a clip of them reviewing a car, and then they would roll another clip of them um, all together. It's kind of hard to explain. They would play a clip of them reviewing a car first, and then they would play a clip of them all together doing some kind of challenge that the producers gave them. And then that would generally be divided into one or two or three parts. And in between, they would go back to the tent, talk about stuff, review another car or two, and then go back and play the major clip, which is pretty much exactly how Top Gear worked. They replaced the news from Top Gear with Conversation Street, and they replaced the Top Gear test track with the Ebola-drome, because they called it the Ebola-drome because it was a very similar shape to the Ebola virus. And the Ebola-drome, excuse me, consisted of a substation, some sheep, and an unexploded bomb, they said. I want to compare and contrast real quick. I want to compare Jeremy Clarkson's humor to Chris Evans' humor, the British Chris Evans. The funniest joke that I can recall that Chris Evans ever said was, "We don't talk about catering on the show anymore." And it was referring to Jeremy Clarkson getting mad at the kitchen being out of order. Whereas Jeremy Clarkson's, best jokes, real pluralized, was here's one out of the top of my head. He was talking about the daily life of a truck driver. Change gear, change gear, change gear, check a mirrors, murder a prostitute, change gear, murder. That's a lot of effort in a day. And another one would be he saw an American woman in the crowd, and the first thing he noticed was her accent. And he said, "What kind of accent is that?" And she goes, "American." And he goes, "You're American?" And she goes, "Yeah." And he says, "You can't be. You're nowhere near fat enough." He says, and then Clarkson says to Hammond, "Nice to see the colonies around here." So in conclusion, Top Gear has had a very rickety life. It started as a small television program, independently run, and then it became big, and then it became big, but didn't have a lot of fans. And yeah, that's just that's how the BBC runs things, I guess. And of course, you got to remember the BBC was open to a lot of more things back when Clarkson, Hammond, and May were running it, but now it's a little more limited. So, with that, I think it is time to end this episode. Have a good day, and subscribe to Amazon Prime.